Chapter 7. October 2006. "You're conflicting," says Lana that evening. "I know you too well. In the office, you wanted to teach McCann a lesson, but then you met him afterwards, and now you feel sorry for him. You tricked him into thinking there was a contract, but there was always an implied contract. Margaret couldn't decide whether to be angry with me or relieved. McCann didn't directly admit to plagiarism, but he apologised for it, and in the most beautiful handwriting. In any court, he's guilty," says Lana, "but he acted honourably in the end, which is more than I did. The story," she says, as the telephone rings and she gets up to answer it, "of him being flown home." Before I say anything, she picks up the phone and says, "Yes, he's here. Who's calling?" "It's someone called Vince Reynolds," she tells me. Talking about McCann, I had managed to forget Vince for a while. Taking the offered phone, I hear him say, "Hello, Elliot. I can't get out of this one." "Please don't ring off," Vince says quickly. "I'm on a mobile because I assume you've blocked the landline. How can I help?" Lana is looking at me only mildly interested. "We need to discuss what happened at Thirsk Airfield," says Vince. "We have to make some decisions. I can think of a dozen different things I want to say, such as why, or why now, or fuck off, leave me alone. But instead, I suggest call me tomorrow during the day. This evening's not a good time. As long as you do talk to me. If you're out, I'll drive over to see you. I've found your address." "That won't be necessary," I say calmly. If Lana wasn't listening to my side of the conversation, I would accuse him of threatening me. "We'll talk tomorrow." He agrees, reluctantly, and so we end the call. "Who's Vince Reynolds?" says Lana. Several untruths come to mind, all plausible, but I can't lie to her. Lana will find out in due course. As she says, she's psychic. "An old school friend." "I assumed you'd been Billy No mates," she teases me. "I had a few friends. For a while, Vince was my best friend. And he's got in touch. That's great, isn't it?" "Not necessarily. He wants something." Lana asks what it might be, and I say, honestly, that I do not know. "Go on, call him back," she says. "Otherwise, you'll only wonder." "It can wait till tomorrow." "Aren't you the tiniest bit curious?" "No, I'm more interested in what we're doing tonight." We watch a film, and I make myself concentrate on it. At the back of my mind, however, there is always Vince. I am amazed that I have been able to get through an ordinary working day when everything precious to me is under threat. Who knows where I will be this time next week, or next year? In custody? In prison? If so, will Lana wait for me? Will she forgive me? It's not as though she would be allowed to continue living in our house on Sci-Fi Street. Under the terms of Uncle Kenneth's will, I can stay in the house for as long as I like, but I have to be in continuous occupation. I cannot move elsewhere. If I am away for more than a calendar month, the house reverts to the sister of Uncle Kenneth's wife. When Lana and I go to bed, I am convinced that I won't sleep, but I drift off eventually, and when I wake up, it is not quite midnight. I feel I have experienced a lifetime of dreams. They have been so detailed and complex. I am young, travelling on an old-fashioned bus. My mother is there at first, but not towards the end of the dream. I walk up to the driver to ask him how far until my stop. But it is Uncle Kenneth, and, infuriatingly, he treats it as a philosophical question and will not answer me directly. Recognisable landmarks pass by where I would have happily got off, but the bus continues onwards, and then we are entering Thirsk town centre, and there are policemen waiting for me. I turn on the bedside light and see the dream diary. Lana is sleeping soundly, snoring quietly, her mouth half open, and I don't want to wake her. I am tired, but I pick up the diary and pull the pencil out of the spine, hoping that I might somehow exorcise my dream by recording it. I make brief observations, but I am surprised at what I remember when I read over it. I can take the dream back to before the bus ride, when I am on Saltburn Beach and seem to have only just met Lana. We are looking out to sea, with the pier and the funicular railway to our right. Everything is disjointed, in time and place, but I put some effort into describing Lana, even giving the detail of what she is wearing, an Edwardian bathing costume made of a rough blue material. I return the pen to the spine of the diary and set it down. The memory of the dream on the beach with Lana is comforting, but as I fall asleep again, I recall Uncle Kenneth driving the bus, and I lose control of my imagination. I am dreaming once more, and as I look out of the bus window, I can see we are being driven too fast. Scenery rushes past, and the vehicle shakes and rattles, and suddenly there is no more road, and the whole bus plunges into a crevice. I wake from the nightmare, and it is now 3 a.m. I have also woken up Lana, who grumbles and turns over when I leave the bed to get a glass of water. As I stand at the kitchen sink, I realize my perception of time is at fault. It cannot have taken 3 hours between thinking about the journey on the bus from the first dream to the sickening feeling as it felt in the last. I wonder what else can have happened in those 3 hours' sleep. On second thoughts, I would rather not know. I walk into our living room, over to the wall where Lana's books are shelved. They are a mix of paperbacks and hardbacks, mainly detective fiction, with a few thrillers. I pull out a title at random, The Hill of Dreams by Arthur Machen, and I recognize the cover, but not from Lana reading it. I had exactly the same edition liberated from the airfield at Thirsk. I flick through its yellowed pages, and the smell of decaying paper takes me back to the recycling plant in Thirsk, just as McCann said that the scent of hot metal transports him to Sweden in the 1950s. I reshelved The Hill of Dreams. I had intended to find something to distract me from the past, not remind me of it. Lana leaves for work at 8:25, the same as any other morning. Neither of us have mentioned Vince's phone call of the previous day, or that he is ringing me back. Perhaps Lana has said nothing because she realizes how unwilling I am to talk about it. We always say we have no secrets from each other, but there are some matters we don't discuss. With me, it is my school days in Thirsk. With her, Harrison, her ex. We share an understanding, and it works well. From the living room window, I watch her walk away into a cold yellow sun until her silhouette attenuates and disappears. I shiver and go through to the office where I stare at the phone, wondering whether Vince will call. I know that wherever he is, he has probably been waiting, deciding on a time to ring that is early, but not too early. That is the Vince I used to know, making himself not dial my number until the exact moment he has decided upon in advance. I fire up my laptop, doubting I will be able to do any work. While it runs through the antivirus check, my eye is drawn to the phone, and if I concentrate hard enough, I can almost see Vince at the other end of the line. I decide he will be on his own, somewhere he won't be disturbed. Perhaps he's at home, like me. I wonder if he has a wife and children. I imagine him sitting at his kitchen table. I see him, incorrectly, I am sure, in a house such as his parents once had. I picture him staring at the number, ready to call, but I have no idea how he might appear now. I'm not convinced I can even remember how he looked at school, apart from his distinctive hair. I have no photos that would have reminded me over the years. He was once thin and fresh-faced, I recall, but has he grown fat or become bald? 8:32. I am squandering my time, so I get up and start on household jobs, emptying the bins, filling up the washing machine and turning it on, cleaning out the fire and laying a new one. I even make a pile of kindling from a pallet that has been dumped in the alley behind our house. It feels like a full morning when I am done, but it is only just gone 9. I have also made and finished a cup of coffee. And so I move on to chores I've been threatening to do for the last few weeks. Clearing out the fridge and wiping it down, and, because the minute hand continues to drag itself so slowly around the face of the kitchen clock, I defrost the freezer using Lana's hairdryer to melt the ice. I am even standing by the washing machine counting down as it works through the final minutes of its cycle. I hang out the clothes in the yard rather than use the tumble dryer. 9:45, and I'm at my desk once again. I've done a good deal of thinking while keeping busy, and the one thing I am certain of is Vince will call on the hour. Suddenly, I lose my nerve and leave the house after all. It is as I slam the front door after me that I hear the phone ringing, or I think I may have heard it. I check my watch, and it is exactly 10. I walk away, telling myself, as I cross the road, that it would be difficult to tell if it is our phone or a neighbour's. Anyway, if it is ours, Vince would most likely ring off before I could get back inside. Persimmon Press has 2 potential customers this morning. Amanda has a suspicious eye on them as they browse through our display of books. She assumes they are time wasters, and she will be right. We rarely sell a guide ourselves. Although it resembles a shop from outside, most of our sales are through distributors in Gateshead. "Afternoon," says Janet pointedly, and I say, "Hello," but we are careful with our choice of words because there are members of the public present. We usually indulge a routine of discussing whether Margaret is in, referring to her as the Old Dragon, Mrs. Waste of Space, or Madam Ship for Brains. But now I ask if she who is to be obeyed has arrived, and Janet says, "No." "You do realise," she adds, "that some of us have been working for hours?" Janet and Amanda are always punctual, through the door before 9, but I am legitimately allowed to work from home because I am freelance. "I was waiting for a call," I say, but it never came. "We have to discuss the photos for the Spanish guide. You are going to Barcelona, aren't you?" "Yes, and I'm taking Lana, but we have to look at our diaries." "Both on Passam and expenses?" "I wouldn't give Margaret the satisfaction." "What, of having an excuse to sack you?" "Again?" says Amanda. As we are talking, the door opens. Of all people, I hadn't expected to see McCann again, not after yesterday. He is frowning and nervous, and he is carrying a large red jerry can. At first glance, it simply seems odd, but within a second I smell petrol and my stomach heaves. I stare at where there should be a stopper on his can, but in the hole is stuffed a lump of material. Chapter 8. Summer 1988. My relationship with my father continued to be strained, but it was because of his religion rather than the shop. I no longer went to church with him twice a week, but to my annoyance, all too often he seemed to bring the church home. Because it was integral to his everyday life, so it was part of ours, and this irritated me profoundly. I could not understand what he believed or why, and he refused to explain himself properly. The fact that my father did good work for the Church of England and the Methodists implied he didn't care about the differences between denominations. I thought that if you professed belief, you ought to take such differences seriously. And then the evangelical church started holding services at the weekends in our school hall, and my father volunteered to help them as well. My mother always tried to be tolerant, but this exasperated her as much as it did me. My mother referred to Dr. Emmanuel Breeze, the man who led the evangelical services, as a charismatic and it was obvious she didn't apply the term in the same way as she would to an actor or a pop star. When I looked up the word in Old, New and Alternative Religions, I read, "Charismatic Christians believe the gifts of the Holy Spirit are available to followers. Signs, miracles and wonders, including speaking in tongues, prophecy, healing through the laying on of hands, and the discernment of spirits." For once, a local form of Christianity struck me as interesting, if only because it had the potential to be bizarre. I asked around, genuinely wanting to know more, but the two Christians in my English class who admitted to going to the services wouldn't say anything about them. When Vince and I queried such phenomena as discerning spirits and faith healing, they were uncomfortable and became tight-lipped. We often talked of attending one of their services, but we never had the nerve to do so. Then the evangelists announced through posters and flyers plastered all over town that they would hold a Christian revival meeting on the flats. Vince and I resolved we would go and observe them. My father, as usual, would give his time to help. "And I hope you'll be coming," he said to me. The agreement that my mother and I would only accompany him to church 3 times a year didn't stop him from regularly checking I hadn't changed my mind. "Why are you getting so involved?" asked my mother. "I'm proud to be associated with it," he said. "It's not just for the church, but for the whole community." "But there is no such thing as the church," I pointed out yet again. "They're all different. Have you not noticed the Church of England doesn't practice faith healing and talking to spirits like the evangelicals do? But they all worship the same Jesus," he said with a smile. "Their methods may be superficially different, but they're the same below the surface. There's only one God." "But they are not superficial differences. That's why there have been religious wars over the centuries." Dr. Breeze had already been to see my father, and I was told that when he next visited, he'd be happy to discuss these matters with me. However, I was less than impressed by the man. I doubted his credentials as a doctor, just as I doubted the sincerity of his smile and his need to wear a shiny new suit, tie and waistcoat on all occasions. In his affected old-world manners, I sensed a fraud, and I was annoyed by the way he would undo his jacket button before sitting and automatically fasten it when he stood. He would rise when my mother entered the room and sit down, and repeat the same actions when she left, all the time buttoning and unbuttoning himself. It was quite comical. When Dr. Breeze came to our house, my father put the question to him regarding wars fought in the name of religion, and he claimed to be delighted by my curiosity. "We all love Jesus," he said. "The greatest sadness is we don't all love each other." There was something about him that tended to kill my very real interest in the argument, and he was content to take my silence as understanding. He moved on to discussing with my father the program for the Christian revival meeting, which seemed to be growing in size and scope. At first, all I knew was that there would be various events on the Saturday afternoon, followed by a film in the evening, and then a service on Sunday morning. They were asking the Protestants, Catholics and Methodists not to have their own services, but share an interdenominational one with the evangelicals. This was apparently proving awkward, but my father was facilitating negotiations. "I hope you and your family will be coming?" Dr. Breeze asked my father. "We'll be supporting him," said my mother, with little enthusiasm. "And you, Sonny?" "I'll be there with friends," was my honest reply. "There'll be pop groups. That's your kind of thing, isn't it?" "It depends who is playing." "What does it matter?" my father asked. "Modern music all sounds the same." The meeting hadn't been discussed at school until the news spread that there would be live music, albeit that it was bound to be performed by Christian rock bands. Despite jokes that the film would be the life of Brian, the rumour was that it would be Tron, even though no one could identify the source of this information. "Don't ask me," said my father, when I queried this over dinner. "It's one of those things to make the meeting appeal to a wider audience." "Isn't that rather cynical?" I asked. "There's nothing cynical about exposing people to the love of Jesus. The more the merrier. That's why such a large public address system is needed. The event will be amplified because we know Christians are travelling from all over North Yorkshire." "Your expected crowd of 3,000 is optimistic," said my mother. "No," he replied, "it is ambitious." Additional information came out at the last minute that there would also be fairground rides. An old-fashioned carousel had been hired, as well as dodgems. My friends and I intended to muck about on these, load up on the free refreshments, laugh at the bands, see what the film was, and then go on a party planned at Steve Bain's farm on Sutton Road. Apart from me and Vince, nobody else wanted to hear any sermonising, not even to scoff at. "Would you be willing to help out?" asked Dr. Breeze the night before. The question was put to me as he was leaving our house, as if it was an afterthought, not of any account. "That depends," I told him, knowing from experience that turning down such a request without listening to the details would result in an angry lecture from my father. "I want you to be part of the show," the dubious doctor said, as though bestowing a great favour. My father was beaming, although my mother looked unimpressed. "I've heard about your brittle bones," said the man, with a sincerity that might look real on stage, from a distance, but was much less convincing up close. "On Saturday afternoon, with God's love and every Christian soul in Thirsk behind us, I believe we can effect a cure." "I don't need a cure. It's not guaranteed," he cautioned. "But what have you got to lose? Only your crutches." "But I don't use crutches. They're symbolic of your affliction." "But I'm not afflicted," I explained. "I had problems when I was younger, and I had to be careful, but I've been taking calcium supplements for years now, and I get tested regularly. I'm okay these days." "That is wonderful. But your father assures me you'll have to take pills for the rest of your life. Wouldn't you rather throw them away and never worry about breaking a bone again?" I found myself saying yes, while continuing to preface every sentence with "but." However, to my dismay, the doctor got his way. "What am I meant to do?" I asked my father when the man had left. I was horrified by the prospect of standing up on a stage in front of my friends. "Be guided by Dr. Breeze," he said, "and by God's sweet love." "I'm not so sure it's a good idea," said my mother. "Of course it is. You're using Eliot to ingratiate yourself with the evangelicals." "No, I'm trying to help. If you loved Eliot, you'd give him this chance of hope." "Don't you ever question my love for our son? I don't understand why you're acting this way. If you thought they could really help, why not try their holy mumbo-jumbo in private rather than before the whole of Thirsk? It is not mumbo-jumbo. There are countless instances of spiritual healing on record. You're letting your religious doubts come between Eliot and his health and happiness. Utter nonsense." I loved my mother for recognizing I would not want to participate in the public display. I was dismissed, but I could hear the argument carrying on at a distance. It was inevitable I would have to go along with whoever won, and I was devastated when it was my father. I felt as though my mother had let me down. The next morning at breakfast, I made my case once again. "Too late," said my father in his firmest voice. "It has been agreed." "I am 15 and can make decisions for myself, especially those of a spiritual nature." "You'll thank me when you're healed." "In the improbable event of a miracle, it won't be worth the humiliation." "And even if it doesn't happen," he said, as he spread jam on his toast, "when you're older, you'll understand why I'm insisting." I doubt that, and I proceeded to offer him both barrels of my knowledge of world religions, Breezy's crackpot beliefs and my father's own misunderstanding of Christianity. I thought I was persuasive and, to his credit, he did listen to me and kept calm. But he was not going to concede. "While you live under my roof, while I clothe and feed you, and you're not yet 16, you should honor your father." I said, "Honor is something you ought to earn, not demand." He shook his head. "I fear you will never meet our Lord Jesus Christ. I'm just as likely to bump into him as you are. But if it happens, would you recognize him and accept him as your saviour?" The atmosphere in the house was not good. Although my father was barely home for brief visits, snatching a cup of tea mid-morning and a sandwich at lunchtime, I had an idea of what they wanted me to do, but when I made the suggestion to my mother, she said no, they would not be that crass. When I asked my father again what they expected of me, I was told to go with the flow. I felt worse than on my first day at school in Thirsk, but at least back then nobody knew me. Now there was the real danger that the hard-won credibility I had built up would be blown away like dandelion fluff. Being in any way associated with the evangelicals would not impress anyone. It didn't help that I was required to dress smartly, and an uncomfortable compromise was reached whereby I wore my wedding suit, but no tie. I had no option but to brazen it out. When I met up with my friends on the flats, there was plenty of fun at my expense, but I rode the jokes, saying I would be up on stage to convert them all. I acted out how I imagined Dr. Breeze would sermonize, a hell, fire and brimstone preacher damning their immortal souls. It was considered by all to be a splendidly blasphemous routine, but naturally the jury was out until they saw how I handled my moment in the religious spotlight. "But this is a joke, isn't it?" said Vince, wanting reassurance. I gave him and Sarah a solemn assurance that I would not allow Breeze and my father any satisfaction. They asked how I meant to undermine them, and I didn't mean to act mysterious, but I had no idea what would happen, much less how I would react. My mother had assured me it wouldn't be too embarrassing, but I could tell that this was wishful thinking. Sarah hung around, cautious, sensing that if I let myself down, she would have to disassociate herself from me. In the short time before I was due on stage, she did not exactly recoil from me, she simply made herself unavailable. Despite my fear, everybody else was enjoying themselves. The rides were free, but the queue for the dodgems was too long, and though we didn't wait more than 10 minutes between turns on the carousel, it quickly became boring. The refreshment tent opened at 3, and there was tea, coffee and juice, and slightly soft digestive biscuits. Everyone from school complained, but ate and drank as much as they could on principle. I couldn't join them. I had even been too nervous to eat lunch. The rumour gained momentum that U2 would perform in the afternoon. Those who were fans admitted, embarrassed, that Bono and the other members of the band were committed Christians and often turned up at events such as ours. In reality, the two acts that played were unheard of: Redemption and The Shout of Angels. The sound made by both bands was impressive, but we all knew that when they sang about love, they directed it at Jesus or God, although they refused to make this explicit. We all sat on the grass with our backs to them, proclaiming it a scam, saying we would respect them more if they were honest and threw in the occasional hallelujah. "Never trust a Christian," shouted Vince between songs, and we all chorused, "Amen." My non-believing friends all stayed in one large group. I had assumed that others would be mingling on the field, but from what I could see, the Methodists, Baptists, and Church of England worshippers were all in tribal clumps as well. There was one group, all wearing white smocks, who attracted attention because they were predominantly black, which was surprising, considering this was rural North Yorkshire. "The Children of the Cross," said Vince. "Who?" I asked. "They aren't mentioned in Cooper's book." "They're relatively new. Millennialists. They believe the world is going to end. What happens when they wake up on January the 1st, 2000? It isn't an issue. They're absolutely certain. And until then, they can smile smugly at the rest of us. You've met members of this cult. They reckon they're a bona fide church, and they say Christ is here already to shepherd believers into heaven. A friend of my mother has signed up. He was a Unitarian, a nice bloke, and a bit of a hippie, with Amnesty International posters in his kitchen. He has a thing about helping African charities and has done huge amount of fundraising. He even got to talk with Bob Geldof. Wow! Did Bob swear a lot? If he did, Matthew wouldn't have repeated it. He's not that sort of person. Matthew's the man who joined this church. He was already religious, but in a low-key way that wrong-foots you. But it's amazing how often people who change denominations don't just go for a slight shift in belief. Matthew doesn't only claim that Christ was the Son of God, he now thinks he actually met him. Matthew was talked into flying out to Nigeria to see the big man himself. He sought me out, he said, because I have an open mind. Who? Christ? No, Matthew, you cretin. That's a disappointment. Is Christ with them today? I doubt it. How do you know? I'd expect more of a buzz if he was. If we get to meet him, it would be a talking point in religious education. If their Christ is Nigerian, he must be black. The original was as well, but Mr. Ovenden always insisted we should use a pink felt tip to colour him in. Dr. Breeze ran out on stage with a microphone. He resembled an over-enthusiastic game show host, but instead of comedic patter, he started professing his love for Jesus, and there was a disquiet among my friends. Nobody wanted to sit around and listen to this, but by then everybody knew I was to be part of the farce, and they were curious. Could I possibly do anything to save myself from utter humiliation? Either way, they would wait and see. I wished I'd never told anybody, then we would all have left early and I could have sneaked back. Even if the embarrassing news had subsequently become known, I would have been able to offer a version of events that didn't make me out to be the complete idiot I was certain to appear. When it came to the time I was meant to be on stage, I did my utmost to play it cool by not immediately getting up and leaving. 5 minutes later I stood, made my theatrical goodbyes and walked, looking as unconcerned as possible, towards the front. I didn't recognize anybody else on the flats until I was close to the stage, when I passed by Mr. Ovenden, who pointedly ignored me. As it was, I discovered when I arrived backstage that the program was running behind schedule. Those organising the event said my timing was good and ushered me to the steps at the side, hidden by the curtain. The fear that had been building up all day now threatened to vent itself through vomiting. From my new perspective, I could see there was a bigger crowd than I had realised. There were hundreds of people, although I was not sure there was even 1,000, let alone the 3,000 planned. Whoever they may all have been, Dr. Breeze was working his audience very professionally, continuing to proclaim his love for Jesus, bringing himself to the boil. His intonation had started out low and honeyed, like a voiceover on an advert for a box of chocolates, but soon it became driven, almost angry. I had to admit that Breeze was impressive, but when I looked to the crowd, they did not appear to share his enthusiasm. Nevertheless, all eyes were on him. "I know there are people here today who are afflicted and unwell," Dr. Breeze announced, and began to act as though he was holding back tears. "People in pain, suffering." Then there came a sob. His performance was powerful, but general. Suddenly he jumped as if hit by an electric current. Now, in a shaky voice, he said something nobody could catch. He mumbled, then appeared to pull himself together. "I have been contacted by the spirit of somebody called John," he said. "John was much loved, but passed over to the other side very recently." It was the cheapest trick imaginable. He had chosen the commonest name he could think of, but then he said, "No, wait. He was known to those who loved him as Joey. No, Michael is his name." I was certain he was fishing, looking at his audience to see if there was a positive reaction. I wondered how many names he would work through until he chanced upon a candidate among his congregation. Then he continued with more certainty. His loved ones knew him as Joey, but his name was John Michael, and he died by violence in the furnace of war. I did not understand what was happening, and I am sure nobody else did either. Vanessa Michael was a near neighbour, and her husband, Joey, a soldier, had died only a few months before in Northern Ireland. Breezy's pronouncement might have sounded remarkable to an outsider, but Joey's proper name and nickname had both been reported in the local newspaper, and the whole town was aware of his death. The crowd was silent, save for a couple of unrepresentative hallelujahs. And then, from the middle of the flats, appeared Mrs. Michael. She walked forward as if in an unconvincing trance, and I thought, for a moment, that she was in on the routine. There was a growing murmur from the audience, and she was helped up onto the stage. Dr. Breeze was solicitous. A chair was found for her. He knelt down, his voice in a low register through the public address system. "Joey wants you to realize he died without pain. He is happy in the life beyond." "Fake!" somebody cried out from a roundabout where my friends would be. "It was in the papers!" shouted a woman's voice. "Shame!" was screamed by another as the crowd became restless. But Dr. Breeze carried on. "His one regret, he tells me, is he won't ever see his baby." The heckling and the hostile restlessness ceased. A moment later, Vanessa Michael slipped off her chair as she fainted, and there were gasps. An enthusiast started chanting, "In the name of Jesus! Jesus!" "Yes, in the name of Jesus," responded Breeze in a more impassioned, inspired voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Lord knows everything. He has access to our inmost hearts, and we can hide nothing from him." 2 first aiders had come to Mrs. Michael's rescue, and with what appeared to be smelling salts, they revived her, helping the woman to her feet. Breeze walked up and put his arm around her shoulders in a way that was overly familiar. I didn't think Mrs. Michael would have accepted his intimacy had she not been in shock. He held the microphone between them. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, "but your husband is happy with Jesus." In a thin, quavery voice she asked him, "How did you know about the baby?" As if it was the most everyday of explanations, he said, "Because John Michael told me, and he is so pleased for you. He says—" And then he paused, putting his free hand to his temple, as though receiving messages from the ether. "You want to name the child after him, and he says it would make him proud." It was astonishing. I watched Vanessa Michael being helped off the stage just as a good-looking young woman of perhaps 25 came up to me and said I looked fab. I hadn't been thinking of anything except Breeze's performance, moving from anger through to awe at his knowledge of something Vanessa Michael didn't seem to have told anyone. The woman beside me took my hand and squeezed it. She whispered that I was on stage next. My heart resumed racing, and despite eating and drinking nothing since breakfast, I desperately needed the toilet. My legs went weak and my mouth was dry, and then, as Breeze mentioned his love for Jesus for the 100th time, the woman kissed my cheek and told me ecstatically she loved Jesus and she hoped I did too. Her face against mine, the smell of her perfume, and then the press of her breasts as she briefly hugged me made me dizzy. I was disorientated enough without my hormones waking up and shouting at me. I was passed a pair of crutches by a man who had been ignoring me until that moment, at the same time as Dr. Breeze called me on stage. There was applause, but I froze. "Go on," the woman urged me, and kissed me on the ear. "Go to the doctor." I found myself starting to walk forward, using the crutches, and as I looked out over the audience, I saw Sarah, and the expression on her face was one of disgust. I knew my father and mother were out there too, but thankfully I couldn't see them. "Here he is," proclaimed the excited doctor, "the boy with 1,000 broken bones." On the stage, midway between the young woman and the evangelist, I stopped. For no reason I could ever explain to myself or anybody else, I dropped one crutch and held the other like a machine gun. I pretended to spray Dr. Breeze with bullets, making the kind of noises that always sound so convincing inside boys' own heads. The doctor's smile faded, but his voice boomed, louder than before. "It is true, isn't it? Your bones have literally been broken 1,000,000 times." In 2 giant paces, he was alongside me, and the microphone was thrust in front of me. I managed an awkward, hoarse, "No." "Oh, come on, Elliot. You've been in and out of hospital on so many occasions. Don't be shy because your friends are out there. You need those crutches. But with Jesus' love, you can and will be healed." He tried to infuse a congregation that was baffled because I had taken a step away from Breeze and was standing with my arms folded, looking as angry as possible. He asked me a question about Jesus, and what I wanted to shout was, "You are a fraud, Mr. Breeze." But all I could hear coming out was the one word, fraud, thin and weedy. I started to walk to the front of the stage, but his hand was on my shoulder, so I wheeled around, and now, finally, I shouted, "Fuck off, fraud!" He let go of me, drowning out whatever else I might say with more of his professed love for Jesus, his love for the people of Thirsk, and his overwhelming love for me in particular. I jumped off the stage as athletically and as theatrically as I could, hearing Breeze tell his audience that they had witnessed a feat of miraculous spiritual healing. But as I landed on the ground, my ankle gave way and jagged lightning tore up the length of my whole leg. I didn't remember falling, but I recalled being helped up by a short woman with a large, round face who smiled beatifically at me and said, "There you go, pet. You only stumbled." To my surprise, there was no longer any pain, and I could put weight on my leg. The crowd parted before me as I walked forward with more confidence. I knew I was red and sweaty, and I felt a fool, but I could see my friends, and I held up both hands to give them V for victory signs. I hoped Breeze would see this as an insult. For several seconds, everyone looked bemused, but it was Vince who suddenly led the cheering, making whooping sounds and, ironically shouting, "He is healed!" Sarah joined in, and everybody else followed their example. Somehow, I seemed to have pulled it off. Breeze retreated from the stage, and it was announced that the film that evening would be something called The Pretender. I left the field in the middle of my rowdy friends. Chapter 9. October 2006. "How may I help you?" Amanda asks McCann. She has also seen the petrol can. "Were you hoping to talk to Margaret Bliss?" "Is she in?" Amanda talks faster than she would normally. "No, and I'm not sure when she'll be here. Perhaps you might come back later. It would make sense to ring in advance. I could take a message." I don't want to believe the man intends anything untoward by bringing petrol into our office, but why is he carrying it? Why has he driven with it all the way up from Norfolk? As if in a dream, I find I can't move. But Janet walks over to him as though she has no worries in the world. I wonder if she has seen the jerry can, but then she says, "Mr. McCann, you really ought to leave that outside." Why is she drawing attention to it? Now he is looking at Janet. Amanda picks up her phone, and even from a distance I see her stab 999 on the keypad. "I called a friend last night," says McCann, who is determined. "He's a lawyer, and he said I don't have a legal leg to stand on." "I'm very sorry, but I assure you Margaret is fighting your corner," says Janet. "I was told that writing my letter was a bad idea. I shouldn't have agreed to it." McCann points in my direction and says, "He persuaded me to write it." For the first time, I notice he has a bright yellow disposable cigarette lighter in his other hand. "I believe the letter is still in Margaret's office," says Janet. "Would you like it back?" "My reputation will be in tatters if the story makes it into the papers. I'll be ruined if it goes to court." "It won't go that far," says Janet, and she actually puts her hand on his shoulder. Again, this doesn't strike me as a good strategy, but it appears to calm him. Janet directs McCann past me into Margaret's office. The two customers, who had previously been observing with incredulity, leave in a hurry. McCann turns around nervously as the door closes loudly behind them. Through the window, we all watch them running across the road. He looks at me again, and I find myself saying, "Some people are strange." I inwardly cringe, but McCann turns back to Janet as though nothing has happened. He doesn't seem to have seen Amanda's phone to her ear, not quite hidden in her hair. "Has Mrs. Bliss sent the letter to Oliver?" he asks, "or made copies?" "I don't think so," Janet replies, "but let's look for it. I'm sure I saw it on her desk." Amanda is speaking into the phone calmly, in an undertone, and she moves to the front door, presumably so she can leave if she has to. I walk towards her, but then worry about Janet. As she has gone into Margaret's office, she has pulled that door half closed behind her. I stand in the middle of the room, not sure what to do, feeling useless as well as frightened. I tell myself that if I go in and offer to help, I might exacerbate the situation. But I can't run out on Janet. We hear the sound of filing cabinet drawers opening and closing, and Janet chatting, apparently unconcerned. Amanda is listening to advice given over the phone, when I see Margaret on the pavement outside. She walks in, frowning. "What are you two doing?" Amanda is straightforward. She talks quietly. "James McCann is in your office with a big can of petrol." "Why?" "He's with Janet. They're looking for the letter he wrote. It's in the Sweden file, but the solicitors have copies. It might be best if he isn't told." "Why a can of petrol?" Amanda doesn't hide the patronising tone in her voice. "We assume he's angry and wants to torch the place." "Shit in hell," says Margaret, and moves backwards to the door and out of it, as if on rails. Amanda and I watch her run away down the street. "That was helpful," I say, but Amanda ignores me. "Yes, they're still in the office," she says into the phone. "Two of us are safe for the moment." "The police?" I ask. "Who do you think? My boyfriend." I apologise, and we both look to Margaret's door, behind which Janet and McCann continue to talk. As in a dream, time loses proportion, becoming elastic, meaningless. But then the office telephone rings and Amanda puts the police on hold and answers it. I hear her say, "It's not convenient right now," and she switches back to her mobile. It is quiet, although traffic passes in the street. And then, finally, McCann reappears, followed by Janet. He has his letter, and perhaps it is the time to rush him. But as I am thinking this, a police car pulls up outside. We all look out the window, and McCann asks, "Did you call them?" Amanda replies, "Yes, because I thought you were planning on arson." "Oh," he says, looking at the jerry can as though he had forgotten he was carrying it. "If you'd given us some warning," Amanda says, "I'd have brought along a potato in tin foil and left it out for my lunch." "A potato?" he asks. "It's a joke," says Janet. "Why is a potato funny?" "If there was a fire, she could have had it baked." "And why would that be funny?" "A joke always loses its humour," says Janet, "when you try to explain it." The door opens behind us, and a nervous policewoman asks, "Is everything all right?" "Fine," says Amanda, "but it'll be even better if you can persuade Mr. McCann to leave and to take his petrol with him." "Was McCann really going to burn the office down?" asks Lana. She is sitting on the toilet, sipping a glass of wine. I am in the bath, wishing I'd agreed to have a drink as well. "I think so, but Janet confused him by ignoring his jerrycan." "Superwoman." "Definitely. I didn't know what to do." "At least you didn't run off like Margaret." She said later she'd gone to call the police, and she did, apparently, from the Tea Cozy Cafe, long after Amanda was already talking to them. "Is McCann being charged?" "I bloody hope so. They took statements from us, although they aren't certain we'll be wanted in court." "Did Margaret ever come back?" "Oh yes, eventually. She was angry and blamed it all on me. She said I was fired." "Again? Do you think she'll change her mind?" "The last time she gave me the sack, she explained it wasn't my place to tell her how to run her business." "Even though she was forced to make the changes you suggested?" "It was either that or we would have lost our distributors. Anyway, I've always enjoyed being freelance, self-employed, never officially a member of staff." "Will she ask you to finish the jobs you've been working on?" "I expect so. Apart from Spain, 4 other guides need to go to the printers in the next 6 months. Janet can oversee production, but I'm the only one able to provide the finished text and photos." "You and Margaret do have a weird relationship." "Mutual disrespect." "But why doesn't she respect you?" "Because I won't accept she knows what she's doing." I dream of James McCann that night, but he's behind Margaret's desk, in charge of Persimmon Press. I decide I will work for him, but he wants to read my CV first, and I agree to get a copy. As though it is the most natural thing in the world, I walk straight into the corridor of my old secondary school, where I look for my bag. Vince is there, waiting for me, saying we must talk. But I catch sight of Lana in the distance, and I call out to her. I am pulled in 3 different directions, and it is too much for the fabric of the dream. I wake up. "You were moving about and mumbling," says Lana. She is smiling at me from the pillow, and I'm relieved to see her. It is reassuring that light is coming in around the edge of the curtains. "What time is it?" 7:30. "I'm getting out of bed, but you're not allowed to. Not until you've recorded your dream." I'm not sure how long this exercise will continue. So far, the one entry I've made describes me travelling on a bus with my mother, and then with Lana on the beach. It reminds me that I didn't get around to writing down the second dream from last night, so I dutifully add, the same bus being driven into a crevice. Now I can't recall what I've only just been dreaming. I look up and watch Lana opening the curtains. The sun comes in and a pang of fear hits me as I remember that Vince was in my dream. I make myself write it down. School corridor. Vince wanting to talk. Lana is far away, looking beautiful but unobtainable. I had come out of Margaret's office where I was being interviewed by McCann. Suddenly, I am unable to add what had been going on before that. McCann, talking with Vince's father, both drinking out of miniature spirits bottles. I pause, feeling there are other shapes and colours I ought to grasp that would enable me to find my way even further back. All I want to think about, though, is how Lana looked in the corridor, standing among the other girls. She has a photograph of herself at school, but that is not how she appeared in the dream. I hear the telephone ringing downstairs, and an old, ingrained fear means I immediately forget everything else. I listen out for Lana answering it, and then for her tread on the stairs. "I told him he was calling rather early," she says as she comes into the bedroom and passes me the handset. "It's your old school friend." Vince's voice sounds uncomfortably close in my ear. "I'm trying to make this easy, Elliot. Can we meet up?" "Why?" "You know why." My worst fears are realised when he says, "I am thinking of going to the police." I almost cannot speak, but I ask, "When?" "Tomorrow. I'll be with you at midday." I am facing Lana over the kitchen table. I have dressed, showered, and made a mug of tea, but she still hasn't left for work. She has been waiting for me. She looks wonderful, but worried. I ask, "What would you say if I suggest we run away together?" "Run away from what? Everything's great here, isn't it?" "You and me living on Sapphire Street? Yes, it's perfect." "This has something to do with your phone call." "Vince wants to see me, to discuss the past." "Okay," she replies very slowly. We both understand that it is time for me to talk. Chapter 10. Summer 1988. The aftermath of the Christian Revival meeting on the flats was positive. I agreed with those of my friends who tended toward a more heroic interpretation of what had taken place. I was clear that I had shouted, over the microphone, "Fuck off, fraud," but there was no unanimity. Some heard the first 2 words, others the third. Annoyingly, nobody remembered hearing them all together. But as no one had ever seen me on crutches until then, and few knew anything about my old brittle bones problem, it was widely believed that Breeze was a con man, and I had sabotaged his show. I went to the party and was the centre of attention, being provoked into resuming my mad preacher routine. At the beginning, Sarah hung on my arm. She didn't know what to make of my antics on stage, but she was amused by my joking around afterwards. Later, we quarrelled about something entirely different, and she made it plain our relationship was over. By this time, the party had run out of alcohol, so I couldn't even drown my sorrows. Instead, I played in the Baines barn, and despite many knocks and falls from the hay bales, I didn't do myself any harm. I could almost forget what had happened when I had jumped off the stage earlier that day. The long-term effects of the revival meeting were negligible, although there were those at school who shouted at me in mock ecstasy, "He is healed," and I would reply, "Hallelujah." Everybody laughed. It was ludicrous, however you looked at it. I returned home the morning after the party, fearful of what my parents would say. I had promised to return by lunchtime, and I left it until the last minute. I slunk in through the back door while my mother was on the phone to her sister, but she ended the call before I could get past her and up the stairs to my room. "How was your party?" "Okay, apart from the fact that Sarah and I have split up." This was the truth, but I implied that the charade with Dr. Breeze was to blame. She wasn't happy to see me with the phony. "He was using me. You do realise that?" "I do," my mother said, and suddenly I could relax. "As does your father, although he was being used as well. I've made him go to Vanessa Michael's house and apologise to the poor woman, and when he gets home, he'll say sorry to you." "Why is he apologising to Mrs. Michael?" "I'm mortified that she shared a confidence with me, and I was foolish enough to think your father could be trusted with it." "About the baby?" "I did my apologising to Vanessa yesterday, but the best thing we can do, once your father has asked you to forgive him, is not discuss the meeting ever again." "Okay," I agreed. "Fine by me." "Oh, and the next time you are in public, young man, in front of a microphone, you watch your language." I started the revision for my O-levels early, although a large proportion of it was done in the shop with my textbooks spread out over the counter or in the office at the back. And then, one Saturday morning, with a week to go until my first exam, I put my foot down and said I had to stay at home and revise. "I'll only need you when it's busy," said my father. "But Saturday is always busy." "Maybe today will be quiet." "If it is, you'll use it as an excuse to go out to see a rep or supplier, or you'll have to take a delivery around to a customer. I won't, not today." "But something will come up. It always does. You'll end up having to help out at the town hall or at the church." "I promise." "I know your promises." "And what's that supposed to mean?" "That I'll be 10 minutes turns into half an hour, and if you say you'll be an hour, well, then—" "That's disrespectful, Elliot." "Your son is right," said my mother, who had not appeared interested in our argument until that moment. "Utter rubbish. Donald, you've been this way for the last 20 years, so I doubt you'll change now. I resent that. You can act as hurt as you like, but Elliot stays at home and I will help you in the shop, as long as you stay and don't find an excuse to slope off. Nobody understands what is involved in running the business. Since Kenneth left, I've been doing the work of 2 people. "It would be easier," said my mother, "if you didn't give quite so much time to the various organisations you support. That effort pays us back tenfold in goodwill. Today it can wait. And what if it can't? Then you'll confirm my opinion that you are a shirker." This was yet another fight my mother was happy for me to witness. In the past, my parents had argued, but she would usually restrain herself until she thought I was out of earshot. Recently, though, my mother had aired numerous resentments in front of me. Some I have heard before, but others were new. However, I did not want to listen to any of them, so I went up to my room. When they left the house together for the ironmonger's, they were continuing to disagree. But I could not turn my mind to revision. I was angry with my father, and I understood Uncle Kenneth's resentment of him. But I was also exasperated by my mother. Years later, I would be unable to remember why, because, looking back, she had been very supportive. I tried to work, but failed to comprehend any of the chemistry and physics problems I was studying, and after 30 minutes I decided I had to go outside. The day was bright and sunny, and it became all the sweeter for being enjoyed when I was meant to be indoors working. I walked around the outskirts of the town, worried I might bump into someone who would report having seen me, and then, on the flats, I met Vince. "I'm skiving too," he admitted. "There are 1,000,001 things I'd rather be doing than revision." "Let's spend the morning sitting on a bench, like pensioners on market day, grumbling about how life used to be so simple." "Yes, back when there was nothing more important to do than break into the ironmongers or the paper recycling business." We never did find any more of those books on religion and spirituality, did we? There were no more cults, mind-expanding secrets, or magic societies. That day at the jumble sale in the church hall, I persuaded you along to the airfield on false pretences. You did, but I've still ended up with a room full of books. There must have been a time when librarians thought it okay to buy all those New Age and occult titles, but then they realised libraries are supposed to be places of information and learning, knowledge and facts, not superstition and pseudoscience, and threw them out. But it was all rubbish. Probably. But you'd have thought there'd be interest in it again. I mean, with the year 2000 looming, I said. It's the end of the world, don't you know? But is it? None of the millennialist churches can agree on what will take place. Some are gearing up for doomsday, while others are expecting Christ to come again. Of course, that amounts to the same thing for the Children of the Cross. Who are they? You could have met them at the Christian Revival meeting if you hadn't been busy mucking around on stage with Dr. Breeze. The black people in white dresses. They don't just believe the world is going to end. They reckon Christ has come again, and he's up to his old tricks with visions and miracles. Water into wine, loaves and fishes. I'm not sure about the refreshments, but he's done the raising of the dead bit, curing lepers and that kind of thing. I'm glad he hasn't lost his touch. I wonder what Mr. Ovenden would think. It's the same as us and Doctor Who. He'd prefer the one he grew up with, William Hartnell say, whereas we'd argue Tom Baker was better. I found a book on the science of Doctor Who when I last went to the airfield, said Vince. Our conversation returned to the books we had discovered at the recycling business, the great and the awful volumes we had unearthed, swapped and sometimes taken back. And as we sat there on the flats, relaxed, talking of anything other than revision and exams, we somehow agreed to return to Thirsk Airfield. Vince and I had never quite fallen out, despite the disagreement over the tarot cards. We had only ever drifted apart, but as we walked out of town, we fell into familiar ways. We talked about what we would do after the exams. Vince was moving on to a sixth form college, and I decided I might do the same simply because I had no other plans. To study what? He asked me. Maths is the only subject I'm any good at. What would you achieve with more qualifications in maths? Are there people out there who do sums for a living? Accountants, I suppose, but I don't fancy that. Teachers, although I wouldn't want to be one of them either. Can you imagine having to face a class full of idiots like us? In the past, we had always made our way to the airfield by the Ripon Road, but now we came to it by taking a lane that was narrower than I remembered, with the cow parsley thick on either side. Even on that sunny day, the brick and concrete buildings stood out stark and ugly against the dull, flat sky. In the distance were the long sheds, recently erected, where they kept battery hens, and Vince compared them to concentration camps, which struck me as fair enough. I reminded him of the stories we'd heard over the years about the bombers that had taken off from Thirsk. Older customers in the ironmongers had told me how heavily laden aircraft would trundle down the rough grass airstrip, slowly gaining speed. the crew praying their machinery would get off the ground before reaching the trees. We had been aware of the whining woodsaw a mile before we reached the place where the man in his sheds was still making fences and trestles. The garage, where Saabs were rebuilt, appeared to have been replaced by another, which did the same thing with Land Rovers, and the buildings that were always locked were, as usual, inaccessible. In the compound of the recycling business, the bales of paper were piled high. Here, everything was unchanged, which was reassuring. We disturbed the crows, as was customary, and found the hole in the wire fence, which had not been repaired. I could see the main gate was shut and padlocked, and we both went through the fence without a thought. When we walked up to it, the pit appeared smaller than it ever had in the past. Vince leapt it with ease and disappeared into the darkness. The crows behind the fence were suddenly raucous again, but I wasn't worried that anybody else was around. The birds calmed down, and it became very still and silent. I worked out that it was more than a year since I had last been there, although Vince said he had discovered the Doctor Who book only a few weeks earlier. I peered in through a window, but could discern very little through the lacework of cobwebs that coated the inside. And then I caught something out of the corner of my eye and glanced up. A moment later there followed the roar of the jet, presumably from nearby RAF Leeming, and it brought me out of my reverie. I realized I ought to return home to my revision. The need to rebel had worn off, to be replaced by the fear of not having done enough work. It was okay for Vince. He was cleverer than me. "Elliot!" he called. My friend was standing on the other side of the pit. He motioned for me to follow. "Nah," I said. "You hunt for books. I'll keep a watch for visitors. But I don't want to stay too long." "Come on," he hissed. "I'd rather not." "Elliot!" With foreboding, I jumped the pit and went after him. Once inside the building, my sight took a few moments to adjust to the gloom. But then I could make out there was an enormous pile of books, looking as though they had been bulldozed against the wall. The old anticipation of discovery returned. "How long would it take to sort through all those?" asked Vince. "Even with the whole weekend, we couldn't do it. If there's nothing good after half an hour, we'll leave. 15 minutes. "Okay," Vince agreed, grudgingly. I pointed at the books. "Remove them from the bottom, and there'd be an avalanche. I've seen a lot of Mills and Boone. Think how it would be reported in the local newspaper if we were buried alive by romance novels. The humiliation. Or killed. We'd never live it down." We laughed. Old habits die hard, and we began to rummage through the pile. Vince found a heavy copy of Moby Dick, illustrated with woodcuts, and I came across a Formula One yearbook. I had been sure I wouldn't find anything, but the bulky volume was interesting. As I continued to excavate books, hoping I might unearth similar volumes from other years, Vince searched alongside me. But the light was poor, and after a while my back started to ache. Vince tired before I did, and wandered away saying he wanted a break. I thought nothing about it. We both knew the layout of the building well. There was a series of large, open rooms where we assumed the airmen would once have slept, and then other, smaller spaces that were presumably accommodation for those of higher rank. There was a room at the far end that was now used as an office, with a big, battered wooden desk, and several grey filing cabinets. We still told ourselves we weren't thieves. We didn't even look in the drawers or cupboards. We only ever took books, although there was often tempting stationery left out. I could hear Vince in the distance, poking about, but then he was hurrying back. "You'll never guess what," he said, his eyes weirdly wide. "What?" I asked dutifully. "See for yourself." I carried the yearbook with me, asking myself if I would actually read it, and could I be bothered to carry it all the way home. I was completely unprepared for what I saw when Vince led me into the office. The room was exactly as it had always been, cold with peeling white paint on the walls. The desk was under the window, as usual, but it was piled high with stacks of banknotes. I stared at them, not believing what was before me. "They're all £50 notes," said Vince. "The bands around them say 100 in a bundle, £5,000 each. There's got to be £1 million here." "But are they genuine?" I asked. "They look real. Do the current ones have Christopher Wren on them?" "I think so. I have accepted a 50 in the ironmonger's." We couldn't resist picking up a pile each. The notes weren't all crisp and new. I'd read enough thrillers to check the serial numbers were not sequential. "They can't be here for recycling," said Vince. "No, that would be done by the Bank of England, surely, under strict security." "If we took one each, then who could tell?" I didn't answer. I had been thinking the same, but hadn't had the nerve to say it. Vince tried putting a bundle in his pocket, but it wouldn't fit, so he put the notes inside his jacket and zipped it up. Then he reopened the jacket and added another. It seemed stupid not to follow his lead. I ripped the band on a stack and divided the notes between my trouser pockets. I did the same again with another, filling my coat pockets. We grinned at each other nervously. "But why is it here?" I asked. In an attempt to answer my question, Vince opened a filing cabinet. It was a preposterous thing to do, searching for clues. "Oh, shit," he whispered. "What is it, Sherlock?" "Look." In the top drawer were 2 large handguns. "They can't be real." "There's ammo," said Vince. I had also seen the box. It was torn open, revealing neatly packed, shiny bullets. "Fucking hell," was all I could say, and Vince repeated my words as though I had uttered something profound. In my memory, we stood for hours deliberating what to do. We should have run away as fast as we could, but the guns fascinated us as much as they frightened us. I am not sure how long we spent staring, but then we carefully double-checked there was nobody around. I even went outside to make certain the way to the hole in the fence was clear. Vince was as drawn to the guns as I was. I don't remember ever making a conscious decision to pick one up and feel the weight of it in my hand. Mine was big, black, and ugly, and it weighed a ton. I had never experienced anything like it. It felt powerful and exciting. And then Vince pointed his gun in my direction, and the strength drained from all of my limbs. "Not at me," I said weakly. "How do you know it's not loaded?" He directed it towards the window and quietly made the sound of firing. "You're not funny," I told him. He apologized, but neither of us put down our guns. We speculated about them, deciding no one could have any legitimate excuse for owning them. We discussed the possibility that they belonged to terrorists, an assassin, or mercenaries. We scared ourselves, but we still couldn't return them to the drawer. Finally, I said, "We ought to go." "Oh, shit," said Vince, and I turned. There was a man coming in through the door. Chapter 11. October 2006. "And?" asks Lana. "What happened?" "I shot him." "Fuck." She takes a moment to consider this, and then says, "Shot him? Why?" "Instinct, self-preservation. He was attacking you." "I'm not sure." "Was he killed?" "I assume so. I saw him fall, or not fall. It was as though he was shoved backwards out of the door and landed on the floor." "You didn't check to see if he was dead?" "Of course he was dead. There was a bloody big hole in his chest. I couldn't have tried first aid, and I was too scared to hang around." Lana is staring at me in disbelief. I say, all hell was let loose. The recoil of the gun was a seismic wave running through me, through the whole building. My ears were ringing, and Vince was shouting. I must have dropped the gun. We jumped over the body, leapt the pit to get out of the building, crossed the yard to the hole in the fence, ran through the spinney. We ran as though our lives depended on it, over a field, across the road, through Thirsk. Once you were out, said Lana, did you phone for an ambulance or the police? I mean, anonymously. I assumed the gunshot would have been heard all over town. Somebody would have gone to investigate. I don't know how I found my way home without being seen. I've never understood why nobody suspected anything, how I've not had to pay for what I did. The story must have been on the television, surely, or in the newspapers. I don't think so. Not that I was looking for it. I shut myself in my room, and I could not stop shaking. I didn't sleep. I couldn't face anyone for days. My mother thought I was having a breakdown because of the pressure of exams. She kept threatening to call the doctor. My father called me lily-livered and said I was bottling it. He told me time and time again how disappointed he was in me. Somehow, I went into school for my exams, and usually Vince and I were in the same hall, sitting identical papers. But mostly, I sat there looking blankly at the questions in front of me, thinking, at least the police won't come inside and drag me out. They'll wait until after the exam. You've always said you failed them. I ended up with the C in maths by being on autopilot, and I received a D in English, but the rest were E's or ungraded. I didn't write a word in history or geography. Lana leans back in her chair. You actually shot and killed a man, and got away with it? Yes, I got away with it, but there isn't a single morning I don't wake up wondering when they'll catch up with me. So, what does Vince want with you after all these years? Blackmail? I can't imagine. I mean, it happened so long ago and, well, whatever anybody was doing with so much cash and those guns, it couldn't have been legitimate. That doesn't justify what you did. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm explaining that the shooting might have been kept secret by the criminals involved. Or, if the police found out about it, they almost certainly decided it was a gangland killing. Nobody would have suspected a stupid schoolboy. I don't know what to say. No. Well, I've not known what to say or do for the last 12 years, and I still don't. It's always been easier not to think of it. She sits staring at me. I say, I'd give anything to go back and undo what I did, but she doesn't reply. It's a horrible nightmare, I say, but she remains silent, and so I ask her to say something. I'm thinking. I've thought about it every day since it happened, but I'm trying to find out how I found myself living with a fucking murderer. That's not fair, isn't it? A lying fucking murderer. I can't think what's worse. I never lied to you. No, you forgot to mention you killed someone. I realise there'll be lots of stuff I don't know about you. You might have forgotten to tell me you were in the Boy Scouts. It was only a few weeks ago you mentioned you'd been to the Glastonbury Festival. But those things don't matter. They aren't important. They never came up before. They're no big deal. But it didn't slip your mind you'd once killed somebody. No, I say. Would you have told me if it hadn't been for Vince Reynolds calling you? There hasn't ever been a good time to drop it into a conversation. Shit, Elliot. Why did you keep it from me? To protect you. To protect yourself, more like. No, to protect us. So it's somehow my fault. I never said that. Are there any other secrets you're hiding from me? Anything else I should be aware of? No. But then you wouldn't tell me, would you? Not unless forced to. That's unfair. It's not fucking fair. I've been living with a murderer all these years. What I want is for Lana to hug me, to say it will be okay, and that she still loves me despite what I've told her, but she does not do so. Later, I realize that perhaps reassurance is what she needs from me, but she refuses to talk. For the rest of the evening she doesn't avoid me, but she doesn't come close either. I can't finish my wine, but Lana has more and then says she has work to complete on her laptop, something she never does after drinking. She sits at the desk in the living room with the screen turned away from me. When I ask her how she's getting on, just to break the silence, she looks up, then down without answering. I'm about to ask again, but I know I'll receive a mouthful of abuse if I do. And it would be justified. There is none of the usual silliness as we brush our teeth that night, and in bed Lana says she is tired, which preempts any attempt to be intimate. I'm sure all of my nightmares are coming true. I don't experience bad dreams because I don't sleep, at least not properly. I conclude that Lana may be right. Vince wants to blackmail me. But what can I offer him? The house isn't mine, and I have few savings. The most important part of my life is Lana, and I may have already lost her. The next day is Saturday, and Lana is out of bed ahead of me. I am silent as she gets dressed. I am waiting for her to say something, and I am desperate for it to be inconsequential and unimportant. That would mean we could start to return to how things were before I confessed to murder. But she walks out of the room, and her expression is haggard. Her eyes are shadowed. She also has slept badly. While I'm having a shower, Lana leaves the house without telling me where she is going, and I can only sit at the kitchen table and hope for her to come home. I am convinced she has left me, but I try not to believe it. When I hear the key in the front door, mid-morning, I rejoice, although our interactions are perfunctory. We act out the role of two people who happen to live together. It goes no deeper than this, but I'm pleased that she seems to want some kind of normality, and that makes me optimistic. Then she asks, "When is Vince arriving?" My concern for our relationship has meant, incredibly, I have forgotten that Vince is coming to see me. Perhaps the one reason Lana is still here is that she is waiting to find out if our visitor has any further revelations. She is biding her time rather than making a hasty decision. I had admitted to Lana I always fear any knock at the door could be the police, and despite knowing who it will be when Vince Reynolds turns up at 12, I instinctively expect it to be the authorities. I am relieved that he is alone. "Hi, Elliot," he says, relaxed and apparently friendly. He resembles a normal human being, not a harbinger of doom. The scene could be a reunion between any two old school friends. We are both middle-aged men turning grey, but unlike me, Vince hasn't put on any weight, and he doesn't appear to have as many lines in his face. "I suppose you'd better come in," I say. His arrival is confirmation that all is crashing down around me, and my feelings of despair begin to turn to anger. I can't imagine why he might be threatening to go to the police. Blackmail must be his motive. I'm sure he will have a hard luck story to tell, doubtless an entirely honest one. Financial desperation has caused him to threaten me, even though he will promise to repay any loan I can offer. I would part with anything as long as I can stay living with Lana on Sapphire Street. I show Vince through to the kitchen. "Lana, this is Vince Reynolds." I make the introductions. "Vince, this is Lana Harvey, my partner." She offers a businesslike, "Good morning," giving nothing away. I say, "Why, Vince, after all this time, do you want to report the shooting?" "Wouldn't you rather discuss this in private?" "I've already told Lana what happened." "Everything?" "Yes." "Okay," he says. I have wrong-footed him, giving me the smallest of advantages. "I assumed," he continued, "you wouldn't have said anything to anyone." "I haven't." "Who else have you talked to?" Just Lana, and that was because I knew you were on your way. So why don't you come out with whatever it is you have to say? Can I sit down? He asks. I point to a chair which he takes, and I walk around the table and sit next to Lana. Vince says nothing, and I'm getting even angrier with him. I prompt, You're here because? Of what took place. Driving over, I was rehearsing all kinds of clever ways of putting it, hoping I might be persuasive. Hoping, well, what? I appreciate that it was years ago, but I can't live with what happened. Why not? I have to live with it. But you didn't kill anyone. Come again? You didn't pull the trigger and shoot that man. I completely fail to understand why he has said this, or the implications, but I know they are profound. I look at Lana and she is staring at me, hard. I realize that I have to handle this carefully. I say slowly, Tell me about that day, exactly as you remember it. Vince composes himself and then says, as if reading from a script, We were in the recycling building, looking through the books, as we'd done 1,000,000 times before. You'd found something. You always did. But I'd merely uncovered rubbish. So I wandered off, and in the office I found the money. Then I discovered those guns. He pauses, looking up at the ceiling for a moment. I steal a glance at Lana, who is now staring intently at Vince. I picked up one of the guns, he resumes. I couldn't believe it was real. I pointed it at you as a joke, and you told me not to. You went white. Not surprisingly. It was an idiotic thing for me to do. But something else had scared you. I turned, and there was this man behind me, coming towards us. I didn't think. I was frightened, so I pulled the trigger, and the gun went off. After that, we ran away. When I look at Lana again, she is staring at me once more. Vince, I remember it different, I say, and it is only then that I fully realize the implications of what Vince has said. But you were there, he protests. I was. And you saw me shoot him? Lana says to me firmly, You told me the same story as Vince, down to the very last detail. She looks at Vince. So, you shot this man. Lana's words corroborate what I hardly dare consider. I have to stifle a sense of elation that Vince is willing to take responsibility for the shooting. My thoughts race wildly, and I tell myself that, of course, my memory has been at fault. I don't know how I can have misremembered an event with such profound implications. What do you remember? Vince asks me. I had zoned out and have to ask him to repeat his question. I struggle to stay composed. The same, I reply, stalling. But I told Lana a lot else besides, such as how we met at the flats beforehand, and we hadn't been to the airfield for ages. But, I lie, essentially I recall it all just as you do. And don't forget, we stole some of the money that was there. Yes, there must have been £1,000,000. We decided they wouldn't miss any of it if we took a couple of bundles each. Look, I've still got mine, he says, unzipping a small leather bag he has been clutching. He pulls out 2 thick piles of old £50 notes, as though they've been in there for well over a decade. They are in their wraparound bands. I could never spend any of it, he says. After all, where would I have got hold of one £50 note in those days? And I was worried they might be traced back to me if I tried using them. Why are you here, Vince? asks Lana. He frowns at her as though surprised at the question. My conscience, he says. All these years I've known I've killed a man. I mean, he was probably a bank robber or something like that. But he was a human being too. You can't kill somebody and there be no penalty. Why not? I ask. We were children, and it was an accident. It's blighted both our lives. Shouldn't that be enough of a punishment?" He nods. "I think I understand, although you didn't pull the trigger. I guess you've been feeling equally guilty." I replay his words in my mind. You didn't pull the trigger. You didn't pull the trigger. And I ask, are you really going to make a confession after so long? Yes, but I don't want to get you into any trouble. I'll stress you did nothing criminal. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then doubt douses my former relation, and I say, for so long I've been expecting what happened to have consequences, dire consequences. Emotionally I can't help it, but intellectually I recognize that by now the shooting can probably be forgotten, written off. "Last year," said Vince with sudden solemnity, "I came to embrace Jesus Christ as my Lord and Saviour." I laugh, although I'm not sure why. I am sincere. I quote a joke Lana and I often share. "Houston, we've lost contact with reality." "Elliot," she says, "have a little respect for Vince's beliefs." I'm going to condemn her hypocrisy. She is usually even less tolerant than I am of any religious nonsense. But I need to get things into perspective. For whatever reason, Vince wants to take the blame for the shooting. I know I should accept this. It gets me off the hook. But I know it is utterly wrong for him to do so. Lana asks, "Why would being a Christian mean you must tell the police?" Isn't it obvious? Not to me. I realize you feel guilty, and whether or not it was an accident, it's something you might need to square with your God. "It will be," he agrees, "when it's the final reckoning. And then he will look deep into my heart, and I hope he believes my repentance is earnest, my sorrow for what I did, my plea for forgiveness." "But how can you repent an accident?" asks Lana. "I'm sure you never meant to shoot the man." "I picked up the gun," he says. "No matter how old I was, or how short a time I had to make the decision, I was offered the temptation to pull the trigger." "He was coming at us," I say. "It was self-defense. And he was a gangster, or an armed robber. They were people with stolen money and weapons." "It was a severe test for a 16-year-old, but I can't complain the examination was too tough just because I failed it." "But if you hadn't shot him, we might have both been killed." "And died with clear consciences." "That's so much bollocks," I tell him. "I can't help myself." "I wish to atone for my sins," he says. "I must face any punishment. I'm willing to go to jail if need be." "Do you have a family?" Lana asks. "A wife? A significant other? Children?" "No," he says. "Nothing has ever quite worked out for me. I've always worried that any kind of commitment would be a waste of time when I finally faced the consequences. I had a fiancée a few years ago, and she persuaded me to see a counsellor. I nearly told them what I did, but it was easier to stop the sessions and to break off the wedding. That's all been an excuse, I suppose." "But what about Elliot?" says Lana. "And what about me? Okay, you don't have anyone else to consider. Elliot will be all right. The crime was mine. Maybe he should have gone to the police earlier. He was an accessory, but his age and the circumstances will be taken into account. I am grateful he's been covering up for me, but there's no longer any need." And then I realise the flaw in the escape plan that has been offered to me. If Vince causes the police to reopen the investigation following his admission, they might yet discover that I was the one who had pulled the trigger, not Vince. It is not a risk I want to take, so I say, with complete sincerity, "Vince, I don't think you should report the incident." But I believe he should, says Lana. It's my turn to give her a hard stare. I have to let her know that the get-out-of-jail-free card I seem to have been dealt might not work. Vince says, I'll spend the rest of the weekend praying for guidance. There are people I should talk to myself, but I am certain I know what to do, and I will pray for you too, Elliot. On Monday morning I will turn myself in to the police. There is a long pause. I am hoping that, unless Vince decides to change his mind, he will stand up and leave. I want to discuss this with Lana alone, and I am scared when Lana asks if she can get a few things clear. Vince nods. Did the shooting ever come up in the press? Not that I'm aware of. Why? Then the authorities never found out. Oh, but they did. My father mentioned it. He was a policeman. What did he say? He didn't normally talk about cases. Or rather he did, but always in a way so I couldn't work out where anything had taken place, or to whom. But he said someone had called them. Nobody seems to have heard the shot, not with the wood saw going, and if anyone did, they maybe thought it was somebody shooting rabbits. But the owner of the recycling plant said there had been trespassers in his building, and stuff moved around. The police wouldn't have been interested, but he claimed that someone had cleaned the floor, and he was sure there was a bullet stuck in the wall. And when they checked, blood had been washed off the concrete, and when they sent samples for analysis, they found the bullet was new and had recently passed through a body. Traces of the same blood were on the floor and the bullet. But there was no body. No. In fact, no evidence of a death. But it was all very suspicious and unexplained. Only because the fingerprints they discovered couldn't be identified. They weren't on their database. I say, some of those fingerprints will have been ours. If they can match them up, considers Lana. You could both admit to trespassing and stealing books. No, says Vince, who does now stand up. I want to admit to everything. Did they find the gun? I ask. I don't think so, but maybe, later, after my father knew anything about it. Who knows? Lana looks at me, and I can see that our thought processes have now coincided. She's looking more worried than before. When I show Vince to the door, he gives me his card, and I put it in my pocket without looking at it. I ask him again not to go to the police, while trying to retain as much dignity as possible. Please, leave the past alone. I know what I have to do, he says, and walks up the short path to the gate, where he turns and waves goodbye. I am unable to wave back. I shut the door, and when I return to the kitchen, Lana is still sitting at the table. Elliot, he's not blackmailing you. He's willing to take the blame. You can't be accused of murder, or even manslaughter if he's found guilty. If, I say, why take the risk? I know. It's so much safer if he doesn't say anything at all. I agree, she replies with reluctance. Let me be honest, I say. I don't care about the man I shot, but I've got a conscience, and I don't want Vince taking responsibility for something he didn't do. Is that more important than ending up in prison yourself? I don't know. It's all right for Vince. He's going to pray for guidance. And pray for me. What is all this nonsense about finding God? Who cares? It's why he suddenly discovered his conscience. But Vince was always so cynical of religion. Interested, yes, but unbelieving because it is all rubbish. When we were friends, he didn't think God was... Lana shouts, None of that's important. And she rushes from the room, slamming the door after her. Chapter 12. 1988 to 1994. I travelled to Newcastle with no coherent plan. As the train pulled out of Thirsk, I realised I could have gone south instead, and I began to panic. I remembered my old life in Cambridge and thought I could get out at the next station and change my ticket. But I was conscious that it was a romanticised, rose-tinted past that was attempting to beguile me. Where would I live? Who would remember me after 4 years away? Did I really want to be recognised? When the train slowed down for Northallerton, I made myself stay in my seat. I had to go where nobody knew me, and no one would look for me. I had been to Newcastle 3 or 4 times, but always with a definite aim: to watch a football match or to see a concert. But as I left the station, I did not know even in which direction to walk. The city was indifferent, harsh and abrasive, and I headed towards the quayside only because I had been there once before. Black clouds rode overhead, heavy, hearse-like, and when it rained, it was torrential. I stood under a viaduct on a busy, semi-derelict street and felt utterly alone. Tall Victorian buildings reared up around me, their stonework uninviting, if not downright threatening. I was certain I looked lost, because people stared at me, recognising that I shouldn't be there. I held on tight to the bag containing my few clothes and all the stolen money, assuming that any small-time thief would instinctively know what I was carrying. The rain eased a little, and temporary sanctuary was offered by a narrow-fronted and austere hotel on Akenside Hill. I did not immediately go inside and ask for a room, though. I had more than enough cash, of course, but I had used my own savings to pay for the train ticket because I didn't want to break into even one of the £50 notes. It was like something from a grim fable. I was sure that any money spent would have to be paid back with compound interest, making it less and less possible to repay the debt. Also, I argued, I knew my concern about the bundles of notes was really an attempt to ignore the greater crime. But another reason for not going into the hotel was that I couldn't think of a plausible explanation for a 16-year-old boy requiring a room and paying with a £50 note. It was only after I had rehearsed a story about birthday money and meeting up with an estranged father that I mustered the courage to push in through the door and enter reception. As I paid the woman at the desk, I felt a fool because she was not the least interested in me or my circumstances. And so I found myself in a frayed but clean bedroom on the 2nd floor. As the rain stopped and the afternoon turned into evening, it became busier and noisier in the street below. People wanted to stop and shout at each other from underneath my window. The dramas played out were impossible to understand, and they often appeared hostile, especially as I could see nobody's face from my vantage point. During the long, sleepless night, I formulated a dozen different plans that I should have considered before leaving home. I thought about going further north, or travelling abroad, perhaps to America. I wondered if I ought to call the Samaritans, or turn myself in to the police. But I did not once contemplate returning to Thirsk. The light of the morning heralded only a day of uncertainty. Looking for Uncle Kenneth in Saltburn felt like a dangerous compromise, almost a backward move. But as I returned to the station, I told myself I could change my mind the moment that a better idea presented itself. I did not know whether I could regard Uncle Kenneth as a potential ally because he was still too close to my family. I didn't have his address, but I remembered that he lived at number 1 Sapphire Street. If I was wrong, I could always ask for directions to the ironmonger's. On my first visit, Saltburn was doing its utmost to look attractive. In thin summer sunshine, the municipal flower beds were at their best. The sea was cobalt blue, and there were even tourists. I read a sign that explained Saltburn's gridiron design, added to by the so-called jewel streets along the seafront, coral, garnet, ruby, sapphire, pearl, diamond and amber streets. It was encouraging to discover that memory wasn't playing tricks on me. I memorized the map, but still walked slowly to Sapphire Street, at the head of which was Uncle Kenneth's Ironmonger's. The shop was immaculate, with an ornate ironwork canopy and everything newly painted in dark green, with details picked out in gold. It was a contrast to the adjacent house, which was in a bad state of repair, with ivy crawling all over the front of it, and the windows so rotten they looked to be falling out of the frames. On the pavement outside the ironmonger's were shiny metal dustbins and incinerators, water butts and brooms. I stalled as I was about to open the door. I am not sure whether I lost my nerve. I was uncertain, hypersensitive, yet strangely numb. At that moment I didn't know if my parents cared or had even noticed I had left home. I couldn't guess if the police were searching for me. The world was unreal and dislocated, collapsing around me. But then I was walking into the shop without realizing what I was doing, and immediately it felt familiar. Uncle Kenneth had created a layout very similar to the business in Thirsk, and the differences were not only understandable, but sensible. The novelty items my father persevered with, the giftware, etc., were not to be seen, and the tools on offer were traditional and of good quality. I was interested in what Uncle Kenneth had done, and didn't realize he was watching me from the counter. "Hello," he said. "To what do I owe the honour?" I decided I might as well admit it. "I've run away from home. No doubt my parents told you." "No, they haven't. They probably wouldn't expect you to turn up here." "That's one reason I came." "Did you really do so disastrously in your exams?" "I haven't had the results yet, but I'm certain I've failed them." "Presumably your father will never forgive you." "No, though he'll claim to if I retake the whole year and do exactly what he says. That would mean working in his shop and going to church again twice a week, at least. I'd have no social life, a curfew, and I'd end up doing as badly next time." "What are you doing here? Seeking sanctuary?" "I suppose so." He laughed. "You do understand that whatever me and your father think of each other, I will have to tell him where you are." "Why? Apart from anything else, it's only fair on your mother." "But can I stay? For how long?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. "If your parents don't give me hell over it, and if you agree to work in my shop to pay for your keep, then we might come to an arrangement." Uncle Kenneth made the phone call there and then, while I wandered around looking at his stock, cringing as I reconstructed the half of the conversation I could not hear. Uncle Kenneth was matter-of-fact, which helped. When it was agreed I would be staying, he put a sign in the window stating he would be back in 10 minutes, and we went next door. My immediate reaction was to wonder if I wasn't making a big mistake. The shop was light, modern, and airy, but his house was, to my eyes, almost derelict. I realized it was the adjoining property I had seen as I arrived, the one with the ivy climbing the walls. It, too, belonged to Uncle Kenneth. He anticipated my objections. "I've still got a lot of work to do," he admitted. "Refitting the shop has been the priority. The house, though, needs attention. It's a ruin. I've had a survey done, and it's structurally sound, but as long as you're here, you can help me fix it up." The rooms were dark, stained green because the light had to make its way in through so much foliage. The ceilings brooded in the shadow, the plaster falling in occasional lumps onto the threadbare carpets. Uncle Kenneth maintained that I would have to work full-time, 6 days a week, with 1 day off every fortnight on the condition that it could not be a Saturday. When it wasn't busy in the shop, he would find me jobs to do in the house. I'd receive £30, which I thought was a pittance, but I could have the attic bedroom to myself, and all my meals and bills would be included. This didn't appear to be a particularly good bargain. It wasn't any better than I'd have been able to negotiate at home. "And if you decide you're going to bugger off," said Kenneth, "as you did from your parents, try to give me some notice." The house on Sapphire Street was uncomfortable and unwelcoming, and the terms for me staying there were non-negotiable. But I agreed to all that was asked. I did not expect to be in Saltburn long. The first summer away from home was strange. Working in Uncle Kenneth's shop, the tinkling bell as customers entered always made me jump, and I invariably had one eye on the windows in case I saw anyone in uniform approaching. Inside the house, it was worse. I had no warning of any knock at the door. When the postman arrived, or if there was a delivery, I would cringe. In the back of my mind was the best escape route, ideally out of the kitchen door and down the alley, although I had worked out that it was possible to get away through the skylight in the attic if I had to. It was more dangerous, but it would allow me to grab the money before I left. It would mean sliding down the slates, dropping onto a flat roof at the rear of the shop, and then using a downpipe to climb to the wall that cut the yard off from the alley. But the authorities did not appear. My parents did not visit either, and neither of them communicated with me directly. They sent on my exam results without comment, but the only document I kept was the one that stated I had a C in maths. Uncle Kenneth kept his thoughts to himself, and when we talked, it was of practical things, such as the business or the house. He was suspicious of my presence, but together we achieved a great deal. We replaced the rotten woodwork and replumbed the whole house. We had a specialist in to do the rewiring, but Uncle Kenneth replastered the walls himself, not the ceilings, and I redecorated everything in white gloss paint and a ubiquitous magnolia. It took a while, though, until Uncle Kenneth curbed his sarcasm when I got anything wrong. "I like you, Elliot," he would say. "You remind me of when I was young and stupid." He had many other put-downs, most of which recurred too often to be funny, such as, "I'm trying to imagine you, but with common sense," and "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm sure it's difficult to pronounce." The worst thing he could say was, "Even your father would have done better than that." Nevertheless, I worked hard and followed orders, and after a few months, I began to receive occasional, grudging praise. I was elated when one day he said, "For what it's worth, that's better than if your father had done it." At first, I didn't bother looking for new friends. People would have asked where I had come from and why I was there. I was not comfortable in any of the pubs in Saltburn, and I wasn't certain I could get away with asking for drinks. I bought a record player and spent many hours listening to music up in my attic bedroom. Headphones on, the volume up high, drowning out as much thought as possible. I had no other possessions, so it looked rather austere up under the roof. I didn't have the nerve to ask my parents to send any of my belongings, and they never offered. I purchased clothes and records in Middlesbrough or, occasionally, Newcastle, breaking into a 50 and depositing the change into a building society account I had opened. Uncle Kenneth did not question my acquisitions and presumably thought I'd bought them with the wages he paid. I hid my bundles of money in a bricked-up fireplace in the attic, but they'd have been safe enough. Uncle Kenneth never came up to my room. I painted my walls Tuscan red, which gave the impression that the attic was warmer than it felt, and I needed all the warmth I could find. The house was freezing, with floorboards missing and holes in the ceilings, and Christmas was a strange and upsetting time. I nearly relented and returned home. However, before I could make a call to Thirsk to ask if they would take me back, my mother appeared in the shop with her sister from Evesham, Auntie Jean. "It was like a bereavement when you left," she said. I'm not sure I'll ever forgive you." "I'm sorry," I said, and started to add, "I didn't feel I had a choice." But my mother had already thrown her arms around me and was sobbing, which made the situation worse. I showed her the shop and the house, and we walked around a little of Saltburn. I claimed I was happy where I was, which was a lie at that moment, but I knew I'd be even more unhappy in Thirsk. I still didn't believe I could share my secret with anyone. My mum gave me my Christmas present, an expensive SLR camera, and I went through the not very convincing pretense of saying I had to go off alone for 5 minutes to see somebody. I took the opportunity to buy her a gift-wrapped bottle of perfume from Boots. A few months after I had first arrived, Uncle Kenneth asked if I wouldn't mind sorting out the shop accounts for him, after he had shown me the basics. He would do the banking on Monday morning, and I took this over. I scrupulously accounted for every penny, but I always exchanged £50 in cash for one of my £50 notes when I deposited them in the bank. This enabled me to launder my notes, and each week I put the clean £50 into my building society. Looking back, I can't understand how I allowed the tainted money to go through Uncle Kenneth's account rather than mine. I don't remember why I thought that if there was any investigation, my subterfuge wouldn't be revealed. I like to think I didn't give too much thought to anything at the time, but I tried to be careful. Mrs. Carmichael in the building society said, not long after I had started going there, what a sensible young man I was to save all of my earnings, and how my employer was very generous. After that, I opened another account in a different building society on an adjacent street, and split the money between the two. Keeping the accounts was useful in that it showed me how much Uncle Kenneth was making from the business, and I soon worked out it was not a fortune. I began to put more hours into the renovations for him, and didn't bother asking for any extra pay. The great advantage of working on the house was I didn't have the opportunity to consider what had brought me to Saltburn. However, not thinking about the past didn't stop me from having bad dreams every night. I don't now recall any specifically, but whether I was in Saltburn or Thirsk, on my own or with other people, events would career along as they do in dreams, following their own surreal logic, and then, suddenly, a man would appear in a doorway, coming towards me, and I would find a gun in my hand. I would wake up with a start, sweating, needing to turn on the radio and listen to the World Service to calm my racing thoughts. The only thing that reduced the nightmares was tiring myself physically during the day. This was easier to do when spring came, and, although we were far from finished inside the house, we moved outside with the renovations. It required a week to hack away the ivy from walls, and then another few months to clean up the stonework. Over the next 2 years, we replaced the window frames, barge boards, soffits, and guttering. Considering the time I spent with Uncle Kenneth, he still wasn't very communicative. But I realized it was not rudeness. He was simply happy with his own thoughts. There were many occasions when I would have appreciated some distraction, stupid stories or jokes, but that wasn't his way. In the evenings he read, as I had once done, but now I didn't own a single book. If he wasn't reading, he was out on his allotment at Zetland Terrace. I watched a lot of television and listened to a great deal of music. The months of unrelenting physical work calmed my nerves, and my fatalism slowly gave way to the ideas of what else I could do with myself. When the days drew out in late spring, I even went down to Zetland Terrace with Uncle Kenneth and helped him on the allotment. It took a whole season of watching the vegetables grow for me to become interested, but over that year I came to have admiration for his skill. I enjoyed his meals all the more once I began to have a hand in growing the potatoes, beans, spinach, etc. I found it calming at the allotment, and I often wandered down there on my own to escape from both my past and my present. I later wished I had kept a diary for the first 5 years with Uncle Kenneth, because I find it hard to remember what I did with myself. After the initial 12 months, I was persuaded by one of our customers, an apprentice electrician, Gareth, to go along to the Victoria Arms, where I could easily buy drinks even though I was not yet 18, and I finally got to know a few locals. There was a group of about 10 of us, all the same age, who would gather in the pub of an evening after work, although it was unusual for there to be more than 5 or 6 together at any one time. We would sit at 2 tables in the front bar and put the world to rights, discussing everything from politics to television, but without ever going into any detail about our personal lives, which I appreciated. I saw plenty of live music in and around the northeast, and with Gareth I travelled down to Glastonbury 3 years running. I also became involved in the acid house scene, and have fond memories of many nights in clubs and at raves. I had no enthusiasm for the music itself. It wasn't something I'd buy and listen to at home, but it was perfect for dancing to and losing myself in for hours on end. I recklessly bought pills that usually, but not always, gave me a high that was wonderfully mindless. It is strange to look back, but the pills steered me away from alcohol, and in turn, the banality of the music eventually took me away from the pills. At this period in my life, I commenced an awkward on-off relationship with Becky, who worked in a local florist's, but we were never suited. We were both too stubborn to admit defeat, and we took far too long to realize the futility of going out with each other. I once made the mistake of trying to ask Uncle Kenneth for his advice, but he suddenly remembered work that urgently needed his attention at the other end of the house. He called me Casanova for a year afterwards, so I didn't bother him again. But what I didn't know was that Uncle Kenneth had started seeing someone himself. When I finally discovered this and asked him directly, he refused to give any information. He was highly secretive, and I assumed, correctly, she was married. I wasn't introduced to her for a few years, although he did let slip her name was Sandra. The ironmongery business ticked along. Uncle Kenneth's real preoccupation was the house, and after a couple of years, he decided we had to re-roof it, which I thought was rather ambitious. There was little he could not turn his hand to, though. Somebody else erected the scaffolding, and over one summer we did the work ourselves. And then, in 1994, Becky moved away from Saltburn, and I knew I had to find other interests and maybe try to meet different people. I began to use the camera my mother had given to me, idly wondering if I might have any talent in that direction. Saltburn is picturesque in the summer, but my first few reels of film resulted in disappointing prints I didn't show to anyone. And then, in Middlesbrough, on one of my rare Saturdays off work, I found an art bookshop that was closing down after only a few months in existence. Although I was uncertain about acquiring books once more, with 2 of my £50 notes I bought several photography volumes that were being sold cheap. I studied how famous photographers had composed their shots. Ansel Adams, Diane Arbus, and Henri Cartier-Bresson, and did what I could to copy them. It was the first time in a long while that I felt an enthusiasm for something. I taught myself, in an amateur way, how to frame a photograph, considering light, shadow, etc. I even set up a darkroom at the far end of my attic bedroom where there was still an old sink. Becoming more adventurous, I enrolled on a photography course in Newcastle and badgered Uncle Kenneth into giving me a raise so I could afford the fees. Our relationship had become rather odd. We always got on well enough, and I really think he was happy to have me living with him on Sapphire Street, not least because I worked hard. Some of the most satisfying times with him were when we were busy alongside each other in the house or on the allotment, when we would not talk, but would finish whatever we were doing, and he would smile and nod to himself as if to admit reluctantly that wasn't too bad. It would never be job well done. Apart from in the shop, the allotment was the only place I remember him striking up ordinary conversations with other people. Fellow gardeners respected him as highly as our customers did. My photography course took up an evening every week, but there were also trips on Saturdays that annoyed Uncle Kenneth. He had to employ a local lad, Tom, who was useful but resented having to do anything for Uncle Kenneth in the same way I had once hated working for my father. And then, one autumn afternoon, I was in town above the vernacular railway. I was trying to set up a difficult photograph, aware of what my tutor had recently been teaching us about light and shade. Black storm clouds were coming in over the North Sea, but Saltburn was vibrant in bright sunshine. The contrast was impressive. I required the clouds as a backdrop, and I had, perhaps, only 10 minutes to compose what I wanted in the foreground. As I framed the shot, I realized that, unexpectedly, my life was okay after all. I liked living and working with Uncle Kenneth. Everything was simpler without Becky around, and if the clientele of the Victoria Arms were no more than acquaintances, I was making new friends on the photography course, including Rosie and Lana, Stacey and Ben. There were already relationships between people on the course, but I had wondered if either Rosie or Lana might be interested in me. I preferred Lana, but she was dropped off and collected by someone in a top-of-the-range Land Cruiser. Rosie had intimated that Lana was in a very serious relationship. I recall looking down on the vernacular railway, focusing my soon-to-be outdated SLR camera. I was wondering about the exposure and realizing I was considering the future positively for the first time in several years. I was feeling pleased with myself, and it was as I was trying to include the steep vernacular rails and the pier in the composition that I saw 2 policemen walking towards me. My stomach heaved, and I would have run if all the strength hadn't left my legs. At other times I had noticed policemen around the town, but these 2 were making their way in my direction with determination. I made myself face them, attempting to accept the inevitable with dignity. "Good afternoon, sir," said the taller, older policeman. "How can I help?" I managed to say. "We're searching for a missing child, a girl. She's 12, with dark hair and a yellow duffel coat." I haven't seen her." "Well, if you could keep your eyes open." "Of course." My knees nearly buckled. I was so relieved I had retained my composure. When they walked on, I sat down on a nearby bench. I felt drained, as though I had been interrogated for days and had finally been released. The wind picked up, the sun disappeared, and any thoughts of my photo were lost. The first drops of rain arrived heavily and unevenly, and then became more certain of themselves. In less than a minute, the storm was upon me, and I needed shelter. I entered the vernacular ticket office, paying to descend to the beach, but I was in no rush to go anywhere once I was under cover. As the little carriage clanked uncertainly down to the pier, the rain attacked the windows, and the wind caused the whole thing to rock unsteadily. There was a lightning flash, and 5 or 6 seconds later a rumble of thunder that went from north to south like a blatant stereo music effect.